All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Artist Statement Podcast. This is our second episode, and my name is Madeline. I'm joined today with our lovely guest, Carson Zullinger. Welcome.
Hello.
Hey. So, Carson, you and I met at the Delaware Contemporary through our mutual friend, Margot Allman, and you did photography for her catalog for her retrospective show. But today is all about you. So could you start by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, that kind of thing?
I've been working as a photographer since the early 70s. And even though my art connection, when I actually started making art that I showed, was probably in the later 70s. But during that whole period, I had to make a living, so I did commercial color printing for other photographers, as well as doing a lot of photography for museums, which I continue to this day. And I've worked for museums both locally in Delaware, as well as from New York to DC. Um, as well, even though the photography was just a part of what I was doing, I was heavily involved with the arts in Delaware. I was one of the founding members of the Delaware Contemporary, which was called the Delaware Center for the Contemporary Arts in the late 70s, and served as president of the board, and off and on served 16 years on the board of the organization. And also have served on the Delaware State Arts Council and currently on the board of the Biggs Museum of American Art in Dover. So it's been a pretty broad-based life experience. I've really been interested in helping create an environment for artists to thrive in this area. When I first got started in the 70s, we sort of felt like we were um, the stepchild because contemporary art was not really considered important in this area. That, that of course, has changed because of the work of myself, but many, many others. Uh, but in the midst of all that, I've been making art through this whole period, and I feel very, very blessed that I've been able to do that.
Yeah. What initially drew you to making art?
Well, back in the early 70s, I was hanging out. I'd gone to college for a year, dropped out. It was pretty difficult period, with the Vietnam War, etc. Came back. I was a longshoreman, worked in factories, but all my friends that I hung out with painted, and they were going to art school. And I tried. I was so excited to be around visual artists. My background was in music. I played multiple saxes, uh, trained heavily all through my youth, and so for me, music was sort of the impetus of my experience in the arts. Um, really loved John Coltrane, but also loved all the you know whether it was Count Basie or all these the generation before us and the incredible music that they did and how creative it was. But the thing that really struck me about jazz that I really loved was the fact that there was always structure, but at the same time there was the improvisation that took place. And so when I started thinking about actually making my own images, uh, I realized that I'm not, I can't draw, I can't paint. I tried. I'm like, no, I don't have the hand-eye coordination. I had really bad eyes to begin with, a bad depth perception. So I thought, well, I'll pick up a camera and maybe that's easy, but it wasn't because I realized that I didn't know anything about composition. I knew nothing about how to make an image, and so that was the beginning of figuring out what I didn't know.
So, what does your practice look like today?
Well, today it's interesting because I've been doing this for a really long time, and I still go back to the basics of why I do what I do. First of all, I love storytelling. In art, I'm really drawn to artists who whether it's literal or not. I like trying to convey concepts to the audience, one way or another. And once again, that goes back to music because music does the same thing. It tells a story, even if there's no words. There's a sense of emotion that you're trying to send to the audience and get a feedback from them. Um, so that's still the primary focus of everything I do. There's clearly transitions over the years of how I do it, um, but there's core elements. I'm still interested in dreams. I'm still interested in kind of the spiritual journey. I like the idea of the ephemeral nature of life and trying to include that in the images that I work on.
Awesome. So would you consider yourself formally trained or self-taught?
I'm definitely self-taught. Um, like I said, my background was training in music. I went to college for marine biology. Didn't have the money really to continue, and but I've always been interested in learning as much as possible. Of course, back in when I first started, there was no internet. All you had were books. You had libraries. So I'd go to the libraries, check out books on art, on photography, and try to learn. And in the midst of this, I discovered Ansel Adams, and I just fell madly in love with his work. But he was, people didn't quite understand that the photographs he took don't really look like what you see when you go out west because he was interpreting it in his own way. But he came up with this sort of the scientific ways of how to deal with the fact that as a photographer, you were dealing with serious structural issues because when you go into a scene outdoors in sunlight, you're dealing with a scale of 1 to 10,000 in scale from the lightest to the darkest point. Our eyes are pretty good at getting the information on both ends of that scale. Film, when you're shooting with the camera, does not do that. It's only good to capturing information of about 1 to 1,000 range. When you do a print, that compresses even further to 1 to 300 range. Now, he figured that out. He figured out how to go out, how to pre visualize an image before you click the shutter, knowing, okay, this is what I've got. I've got these shadow areas, I've got these highlights. What am I going to do to capture all that information? So he figured out how to A, expose the negative, B, how to develop that negative, and C, how to print. One of his famous quotes was, and he was trained as a musician as well. He was a concert pianist. He said, um, the negative is the score, the print is the performance. So before there was any concept like in the digital world where there's so many tools to do post production, he was doing it in the pre-digital age of being able to capture the image as he thought it should be and having some control over it. So I got his books. I read his books. I learned. I set up a dark room, and I started shooting large format film and learning how to do that. So it was that structural element. But then, how do I figure out what do I want to actually shoot? Um, I looked at painters mainly. I mean, I because the Delaware Art Museum was my home. I worked there from '77 through '83. I'd spend every day in the museum looking at art, and then going to museums in New York and Washington and Baltimore, um, and Philadelphia, and you just start gathering information about how do other artists handle composition, how do they tell the story, how do they deal with lighting, etc. Photography, though, is once again, you've got these technical issues. So I searched and looked at uh, books of some of the fashion photographers from the 1920s, Hoeniger and Huner, Horst, um, people who did incredibly beautiful structural lighting that was very, very dramatic. Now, there was no school in this country that taught it. So basically, I would look at a photograph by one of these masters and then try to recreate the lighting. And so that's how you learned is sort of and a lot of the photographers back when I was growing up would go to New York and work as assistants. I have a friend out west who worked with Avedon for like 2 or 3 years before he went out on his own, and that's how he learned. Was to actually be in a studio, learn the lighting and so forth. But those are all just tools. Those are all just tools. At the end of the day, you have to have a concept. You have to have some reason to click the shutter.
Yeah, absolutely. You sort of started answering the next question in your previous answer, but who would you say your favorite artists are, and where do you find your inspiration for photography?
Well, if from the photography world, Imogene Cunningham was always, of course, Ansel Adams, but Imogene Cunningham was really interested in her early work because she was doing the figure and she was working with men and women, uh, and she was telling stories in these really intriguing pieces, and I really loved everything she always did. And she stood out to me because it was not the typical. Um, the other photographers, the Weston, I wasn't. I don't know. It that when I was looking at figure work from the photographers from the 30s and 40s, whether it was Stieglitz or Weston, they were looking at the body as a shape and a form, not a human being. Well, that wasn't me. I want to deal with the sort of the human experience and talk about that versus this looks like a pepper. No, that's fine. Okay, they did it. Okay, and then you move on. So
Yeah.
but
Um,
on the painting side, it's pretty broad based. Of course, because I was at the Delaware Art Museum from being a kid on, the illustrators, whether it was Howard Pyle or Frank Schoonover or the pre-Raphaelites, which I just fell madly in love with and still am. And I still go in and look at some of the imagery and how they posed and what they were saying in the images, and I just think it's fantastic. So.
yeah. You mentioned about the human body and how that's been a big inspiration for you. And throughout all of your work, women are pretty consistently featured as a subject matter. What inspired the decision to feature women and the female form so prominently in your work?
It was really not my plan. It was more about who I could get to pose. And in
Yeah.
the early days, it was typically friends who would pose for me. And there weren't a lot of guys. There was one guy back in the day that I worked with. And over the years, I've had a few men that I've worked with, not because I haven't tried, but it's a lot more difficult to find guys to take their clothes off in front of the camera. Art schools, it's a totally different thing. But in photography world, it's bizarre, and I'm pretty connected across the entire country, and there are maybe 3 or 4 male models nationally who work on a consistent basis. That's very, very small for 300 million people. So
Absolutely.
so it was more about, okay, this is what I have available. Let's work with it.
Great. You mentioned before that you went to school briefly for marine biology, and water is
Yes.
another thing that shows up in your work often. What is the process for underwater photography, and how does that kind of tie in the water into your narrative themes of your artwork?
Well, I first started doing underwater photography back in the film days, but in the 70s, I got a bag to put my camera in and shot photos of my friends in pools just because it was fun. And but once I got in and I started looking around and seeing how cool the lighting was and the underside of the water, and then it all brought back to this memory of being 6 years old, going to the Delaware Art Museum with my parents and walking in. And there were two things I remembered. One was you walked in the front entrance. I think it was one of their annual juried exhibits, and there was a female nude sculpture made out of wood that was life size at the entrance. And you're 6 years old, and you're like, "Holy cow!" And then we go in to see the Howard Pyle paintings, and I saw the mermaid, which just floored me because it's this really incredible story, but it's so beautiful. And I was transfixed. And I joke with my friends who are curators at the Delaware Art Museum that that's the reason that's the whole purpose of my entire artistic career is that one painting.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Um, you have done a number of shows where you exhibit with other artists.
mhm.
What makes those exhibitions work, and do you have a favorite artist who you have exhibited with?
Boy, well, Julio de Cunha. We had the I had the honor to show with him at the Delaware Contemporary, I think 3 times. And he was probably, I learned more from him than just about anyone because he had a studio at Delaware Contemporary down the hall from me, and I was there for about a decade. He would, I would go over and see his work, but he would ask me. I said, "I'm not a painter." He says, "No, tell me what you think. What does it mean? What does it say to you?" And so we would have these incredible conversations about making art and telling stories because he was a storyteller in his work as well. So even though our work was different, it was we're we were both down that same avenue. One of the shows we did together, I asked him. I said, "Look, I want to do a portrait of you," and um, and he says, "Okay." I said, "I want to have it in the show where we're going to show together." And I had borrowed a piece of material that had silver, actual real silver, in the material from Philadelphia from a shop. It was gorgeous and it was transparent. And so he walked in and he was very natty, perfect sweater, just everything was just. And he knows I shoot figures and I he says, "Well, do I look all right?" I pulled up the material like this. He says, "Oh, I suppose I have to take my clothes off." And he did. And I wrapped him in the material. And 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 I had him holding a lotus flower in his hands. And it so it didn't show anything, but it showed one nipple, one of his nipples. At at the opening, he was taking all of his friends over to say, "Oh, look, there's my nipple," and everyone's having a good chuckle. But it was this beautiful, beautiful. It was a three-piece where he's the central, and then I had two women with flowers coming up and two other from each side as offerings to this god. He
I
was
love
an
that.
art god.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Um, can you go about, or how do you go about your installation pieces that you have created?
So um, the first one I did goes back to 1978, and it was a pedestal piece, which I still have, and it was basically a view down of a woman sort of floating up through layers of flowers. And I'd seen a piece at MoMA that year that I have not been able to find out who actually did it. I've searched and searched. It was a teeny little piece. It was only 8 by 10 inches. There were 3 or 4 layers in black and white, backlit, and I thought it was the coolest thing because they're using all these layers. So I made this piece. I thought it was pretty successful. So I just kind of went, okay, let me do that, and so I made the piece, but it was so expensive to do. I set it aside and didn't do any more. Just did two-dimensional work. Uh, when I moved into Delaware Contemporary, one of the advantages is the studio artists get to show in one of the galleries at the museum. So I decided, okay, I need to revisit this. So I'd done some two-dimensional works on the wall where I'd taken, I'd photographed with a large format camera a woman's body, but in just little segments, like half of the face, half of the face. And to do it, I actually gridded her body out with tape, not sticky tape, and then set up the camera to shoot each section, and then build out this tableau that was, I think it was like 60 by 80 inches, and it showed it in a gallery in Wilmington. So I thought about that idea. So then I went back and I was working on this one image where I have the model is sort of, it's almost a Buddha, half between Buddha and and Christian iconography. Um, and I started playing around with it, and then I just started splitting it up into different layers. And it was like, I think there's 6 layers, and I thought that turned out pretty cool. It looks a little bit dissection like, but what's interesting is as you move across, the layers actually line up so it looks like one body. But then as you move apart, they become they spread. And that began a process ever since of doing rather large installations. Um, and some of it is sort of based on dreams, but some of it is from going to museums and finding um, artwork or paintings that really speak to me. The dance, well, let's see, I did one called Entropy. That was in 2012. And that was a full room uh, exhibit, and I did a nude self portrait that was life size. That was on the floor, but there were 4 layers, and then there was a huge 4 by 8 foot transparency that lit up through them. And then I had these other images that related to sort of an image of this one model who's a friend, sort of dissolving across on this one wall, another huge uh, piece where 2 figures are just dissolving into each other. But this is the entropy is like everything is beginning to separate and disappear. The ephemeral nature. So, so that was, um, it turned out to be, it was a huge success, other than the fact that people just couldn't stay away from the floor piece. And they felt like they had to lean way, way over to see if they could connect up all the parts of the body, which I sort of split apart. And 3 times during the exhibit, people fell into it and
Mm.
tore all the substrates, and I had to reprint the thing three
Oh my
times.
gosh. It's ridiculous.
And so my friend said, "Don't ever use that word ever again."
Yeah.
So
It's kind
yes,
of a testament to how interested people were in it, though. So that's,
yeah, no, I mean, I was, and they were all in video, right? Because they had video,
yeah,
security video cameras. So I watched the video and I could see what they were doing. They were trying to screw anything up. They were just like, and they just
yeah.
fall into them.
I love that. That could be art in and of itself.
I
That's
know, I know. It
wonderful.
was really quite something.
Yeah.
So ever since, I've never put another piece on the floor.
Yeah. Fair enough. Very fair.
But yeah,
Lesson learned.
and I also like working on the installation pieces because it takes me out of my comfort zone. It's doing two-dimensional work is wonderful. I love it. I love it. But there's something about doing something that's sculptural. So, and
Yeah,
I think it pushes me. It pushes me to,
absolutely.
and it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes a year or two from the original capture to the final product. I had a model in Anisha New 2 weeks ago, and we did a series of images, and I'm just starting to play with them to figure out how they're all going to work together. So, but I don't know. I'll actually print out small maquettes on transparency material and just play around with layering and what layer goes with another layer, etc. So
Awesome. Great. What role does digital editing play in your work, and how much of your work occurs after the photograph is already taken?
in photography, like I said, going back to Ansel Adams, we were constantly manipulating as best as we could. When you go to the darkroom, um, you you can actually look at my negatives, and the sleeve actually has little markings: burn, dodge, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and so forth. So you're manipulating already. This is just part of the equation of coming out with something that you want, instead of saying, when you take the picture in the camera, that's it. Well, because of that training, I still think that way, but I'm also trying to get the most perfect image in the camera without having to screw with it after the fact. Um, I do light painting, which I've been doing for a long time, but um, this is where I'll work in total darkness, and the exposure might be 3 minutes, and I'm using a teeny little flashlight, and I'm lighting the scene, but uh, it's cool. I this might be okay. So
Oh,
just to give you an
gorgeous.
idea, I just did this 2 weeks ago. So what you're seeing on the background is light, and what I'm doing is I'm actually with the flashlight. I lit the background. I scribbled the background. And then I went in and I lit the model separately.
Mm.
So that image is straight out of the camera. There's no post production. Um,
So,
I, I think maybe just a little color correction, and that's about it. So
yeah,
the more you can do before you click the shutter, or at least know what you're going to do before the final, is great. I mean, I'm kind of freaked out that Photoshop is now putting AI into their software, um, because what the hell? I mean, people have been compositing like since the beginning of photography. So it's
yeah,
not that it's not new. Photographers would put together like 5 or 6 different negatives and make these weird collages. And this is like the 1860s. So it's nothing new, but it's rather irritating that it's that
yeah,
easy to say, "Oh, I just put a building in there. We're getting rid of this person." And I'm like, "Oh."
yeah,
So I don't know. It's kind of a fascinating um, experience. But yeah, I try to make things work in the camera. I try to know what I'm going to do before I shoot, because in the film days when I'm shooting large format, it costs money every time you click the shutter and process the film, etc. So I still think that way. If you don't
yeah.
know what you're doing before you click the shutter, you shouldn't even do it.
I love that. You have been working, as you mentioned, with photography since the late 70s. How do you keep your work fresh, and how do you keep yourself interested in the practice?
I look at art every day. First of all, I mean the fact that we do have the internet, the fact that, but I mean we go to museums constantly. I mean we go to Boston at least once a year and hit all the museums. I go to New York, go to Baltimore, D.C. And so I'm always looking at art, but then online every day, I'm looking at at the feeds from all the museums, whether it's the Gardner, whether it's the De Young or whatever, just to see what they're showing, what's interesting, um, and that's how you learn. The more imagery you can put in your head, it's that database. Because you know, um, I don't know, there was a photographer, I think Eugene Smith. He said, "There's nothing new in the world. There's just new ways of seeing it," and
Mm,
and that's true. So we're human beings. We have the same stuff that we see. I mean, we're inundated with millions of images per year. And you get on your phone, you're going, right? And you're looking at all this stuff and like, "Ah, I don't know." I mean,
yeah.
I do it too. Just but it's like someone called about slow art, about just like just stopping. Well, that's the best thing about physically going to a museum is it actually stops you and you can look at something. So,
Absolutely. What would you want people to know that they wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at your art?
hmm. I still don't have a real good answer for that.
Okay, that's
I
fair.
I think it's really I want people to come away with some sense of story, whether it's their story, which is fine, um, or maybe something that I'm trying to convey as well. But I think it's a lot better if people come away with their own concept of any artwork. So I think
Yeah,
every artist really does. At the end of the day, we're communicating. That's what we do.
I think that's a great answer. What are you most excited about for your future art making practices or upcoming events?
Ooh, well, it's summer. I'm going to be in the pool a lot. I'm actually
Yeah.
working on trying to do more night work. Um, I'm I'm doing research about more underwater lights. I have some, but I'm going to get some that I could put on stands to put into the water, um, and maybe do some work. There's a photographer named Christy Lee Rogers who does a lot of uh, underwater work, but she actually shoots from above of multiple models sort of swimming underwater, and it's very interesting. I'm not going to do what she does. I'm going to go down under the water, but get the same concept, but be able to light it in a special way. And I managed to find lights where I could change the colors. so so I have a different I have palettes that I can work with. So yes, summer is always a fun time, um, and then the fall and the winter I do a lot of editing. Um, I've got a couple books that I'm working on, so that's always fun, and uh, and then start looking at the next show we'll do here at the gallery at Lumen Studio and Gallery. We've got a show right now which is really quite stunning, with four figurative painters, all. Let's see. One of the curators from the Delaware Art Museum came to the opening, and she looked around at the four artists. She says, "Oh, they're all in the permanent collection." She said, "This is a museum exhibit." I said, "Yes, it is."
Very
So
cool.
that
I
was
love that.
yeah, it was a very nice compliment. But it's been very exciting, and this I've never had a gallery like this before to have it so public. But we're actually selling work, which is really cool because once again, way to support artists,
Yeah.
and hopefully we sell some of our own work too. So,
Yeah. Do you have anything else that you would want viewers to take away from this interview or anything else that you want to advertise here before we end today?
well, I'm gonna, I talking about starting photography. I'm going to show you my first camera.
Oh, cute.
Now I got this from my uncle, and this is the coolest camera. Um, I was in fourth grade, It was designed for Kodak by, I forget the designer's name. He was an Art Deco designer. He had nothing to do with photography. He designed this Art Deco camera. And so when I got it, I thought this is the coolest thing. So I went to buy film at the local drugstore. It was so old that it was I could only get black and white film for it.
Yeah.
So that's how I started photography, was shooting black and white, like on school trips and stuff. All the other kids, they're like, nobody had cameras. I was the
Yeah.
only one with a camera. The teachers like couldn't believe it. I'm like taking pictures,
Yeah.
everything, changing film, and but I still have it.
I
but
love that.
but
That's
that's
so
but it's like
adorable.
one of those fun stories that you never know that the things in life that push you forwards, and that's one of them.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Carson, for coming on. This has been so great. You are so well spoken and detailed and thoughtful about your answers. So thank you so much for giving us the time of
Well,
day
it,
for
it
that.
yeah, it was a delight.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to put up your website and your Instagram here so viewers can see. We can't see it right now, but it will be up later. And thank you, everybody, for listening to the Artist Statement podcast. And thank you again, Carson, for coming on today.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.